Welcome to the Word for 2022. Today we're in Nehemiah chapter 4. When does discouragement usually set in? Discouragement usually comes when we're tired or we're physically exhausted, we're overwhelmed, or when we don't see an end to what we're dealing with. It also usually happens when we're halfway through a project, a task, or a situation. That's the situation that we face here in Nehemiah chapter 4. The Israelites, they're becoming discouraged because they're halfway through. We read in verse 6, Nehemiah said, "So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, and all the people, they worked with all of their heart." Now we know because of chapter 6 verse 15 that it took 52 days to rebuild the wall. So halfway through, this is 26 days in, and the people are starting to get discouraged. Nehemiah was told in verse 10, "The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall." And at the very same time, the enemy pressed in all the more. And in verse 7, when the enemy saw that the walls were being repaired, that the gaps were being filled in, they became very angry, and they plotted together. And then they made threats of attacks to kill all of the workers. In response, the Israelites, they were already fatigued, and they had lost their focus. They were frustrated, and now they were fearful. Whenever we feel the exact same way, we need to do what they did. When they were fatigued and frustrated and fearful, they prayed. They prayed, and because of their time of prayer, then God gave hope to them through Nehemiah. In verse 15, we find out what God had instructed Nehemiah to do. After they prayed, then Nehemiah had them regroup and remember, and then he encouraged them to resist. This is what he said in verse 13. Nehemiah said, "Therefore," this is where he was regrouping them, "Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall, posting them by families with swords, spears, and bows." And then he told them to remember. "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome." And then he encouraged them to resist. "Fight for your brothers and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your homes." When we are opposed by the enemy, when our culture is against God and against us, when the enemy seems to be pressing in and closing in, when we're feeling overwhelmed and fatigued, when we're feeling frustrated, we need to remember that what's taking place in our culture, it's the work of Satan. That being gender confusion, the redefining what God has already defined in His Word, the calling of good evil and evil good, that's all a work of Satan, of the enemy. So we need to do what Nehemiah had the people do. We need to first regroup. We need to stick together. We need to stand in the gaps, and we need to work at strengthening one another. We also need to remember that God is bigger than our problems, that God is great and awesome, as Nehemiah told the people. God is with us. And God did not give us a spirit of fear. But then we also need to resist. We need to fight for our families. We need to not give in to fear, but we need not also to surrender to the enemy. We need to stand in the gap and say, "No, we will do what is right," because our family is worth fighting for. In Ephesians chapter 6, Paul told us this: "Be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power." And then he told us to remember that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. It's been said that the news tells us what's happening, but when we read the Bible, then the Bible tells us why things are happening. So we need to remember what Paul is telling us here. We need to put on the full armor of God so that we can stand against the devil's schemes. Therefore, we need to regroup, we need to remember, and then we need to resist, because greater is He that is in us than he that is in the world. Thank you for joining the Word for 2022.